Today I will cover something that I've touched many times in my other videos, and that is data binding. So tune in to don't miss that. Hi and welcome to another .NET MAUI video. In this video I will talk about data bindings and MVVM. Data binding is probably something you have seen in my other videos if you have watched them. If not, and you like to see content about .NET MAUI, please subscribe to my channel because I will publish .NET MAUI content every week. So, what is data bindings? Easily you can say that data binding is about binding data to a UI control. If you have a data class with some properties, you can create a binding object that handles when there are changes in the data and showing it in the UI control. Often you use that with the pattern MVVM, that stands for model, view, view model. But more about that later. .NET MAUI has excellent support for data bindings. It's built into the framework. So today I will show you the basics. So let's dive into Visual Studio. Okay, here I've created a project. It's just from the new app template. But I have prepared a bit by creating a view model that we will use later. And I also created a simple view here with, as you can see, just a vertical stack layout with some padding to get started faster. So, data bindings. You can bind to a separate data class, for example, a view model, or you can bind to other UI controls. And that's the first thing I will show you today. So, I will create an entry and a label. And when you update the entry with text by typing, I will also update the label. So, for example, if I have a label by entering my name, the name will also be in the label. So, in the vertical stack layout, we can go here, enter an entry, give it a name, because we will use that in the binding. Name entry, add a placeholder, enter your name. And after that, we create a label. And in the text property, we will create bindings. So we will use a markup extension called binding that is in .NET MAUI core, so you don't have to reference any namespaces. Binding. And then we will set the source. And the source will be the name entry that we created recently. And then we set the path, what property on the entry that we want to bind to, and that is text. So now we have created a binding from the text property of entry to the label text property. So let's run this. Okay, here is the app. We can see the entry. I can write Daniel. And we can see that the label below is updated. So if we now want to have view model, view model comes from the MVVM pattern. And MVVM stands for model, view, view model. And model is like the data source. View model is the mapping between the view and the data source. So we can say that view model is like the layer for view logic. So I have already created a view model. And what all view models need is the iNotify property changed interface. You need to implement that. And the only thing there is this event, property changed. So that is what you need to have. What I also created in my view model is a name property with a backing field called name. And in the set method, I check if the value have changed. If so, I set the backing field, and I also raise the property changed event, and I do that with a helper method here. Raise property changed, and I pass the property name to it. Because I use this caller member name attribute, I don't have to pass the name of the property here. I could have done that too, like but when the property is the same as the property name here, you don't have to do that if you use the caller member name attribute. So I like to use that. In a real case scenario, you probably have this raise property change method and the event in a base class, but you don't need that, and it's easier to show you in a demo if I have that in the actual view model. So now I can have this name property and bind it to it. I can both bind the entry and I can bind the label to it. So let's do that. So here, instead of having source as the name entry, I will just remove it, because we will set binding context to the view model instead. But let's remove this first. And we don't need path because that is the default value. And we will do the same on entry, but we will first change the name, of course, because the name of the property in the view model is name. But we add that binding to the entry too. And there are different types of bindings. We have a one-way bindings, one-time, and two-way. Two-way means that you can have the binding in both direction, both from the entry to the view model and from the view model to the entry. Let's say I change this property value by code. It will also update the entry, as it will update the property if I do changes in the entry. We also have one way to source, and that means that if I change something in the entry, it will write it to the property in the view model, but if I do changes in the view model, it will not update the entry. So let's do the last step we need to do to have a view model binding. That is to go here to the main page class, and in the code behind set binding context, and then the view model we want to use. So we can set a breakpoint here in the setter to see that everything works. So I can start writing Daniel D, and then hit paste breakpoint. We don't have any value there yet, but we have D as value on the value property. So remove the breakpoint and let's run the app again. Okay, here we can continue to type Daniel, and I will update the property name and also the label, because they are both binded to the same property. Okay, so now if we instead want to change this binding mode to, for example, one time, that means that it will just be updated once. So we can have a default value on this that is, let's say, Eric. And now you can see that I have a value of Eric in both of those, because it's a two-way binding. But if I now change here, it will not change the value of the label, because that is a one-time binding. It will only read from the view model once. So if I now go here and I set this as mode one way to source, and then I go back to my view model, then I have prepared a set name on updates method. That means that with the delay, I will change the property if the first thing I type is D. And that just to see that how the binding works. So we change this back to the default one way. So what will happen now is everything I do here will be written to the view model. But when I do changes in the view model, it will not update the UI. And that means that the label will be updated when this method is setting name to Daniel, but the entry will not. So let's see that in action. So you can see here now that we have no value in here. I can write D. and it will hit the breakpoint, and it will set the name property to Daniel, but it will not update the entry. Okay, so the next thing to talk about is when we have a collection of data. For that, I recommend you to use an observable collection, at least if the data is changing after you have loaded the view. If not, you can use a list, for example, but in most cases you will use an observable collection. So in this observable collection, I will load some data. It's a different type of fishes. So I will add 2 items first, then after 3 seconds I will add another one. So you can see that the observable collection will update the UI when there are changes to the list. So let's go to the SAML and add a collection. So we can add a bindable layout to this vertical stack layout. Bindable layout.item source. If you want to know more about this, you can see that in my video about .NET MAUI and layouts. But we create a binding to the items property, and when we have bindings to collection, we also need to have a template. So let's add a data template. Bindable layout.item template and a data template. And in the data template, I just add a content view with padding 10, and inside there I add a label text. And when I have just a collection of strings, I can just write binding like this, or I can add a dot. I don't have to write name of a property because there are no name of the property. So you will just do like this. Okay, let's run this and see what happens. So here is up with 2 items in the list, and now we have the third one when I call the add method of the observable collection. So to improve the performance of your data bindings and also make it easier for you as a developer, you can add compile bindings. And with compile bindings, that means that you will add data type to the content page. Like this setting is okay. This is a view model. It's from the namespace data binding demo. That's the namespace of the view model, but you need to import it like this to use it. And also on the data template, you can set the data type to make them also compiled. So x:string, because the data type here is string. But what makes it easier for developers is that if you have compiled bindings, you will also get IntelliSense here. Okay, the last thing I want to show you is how to use data bindings when you want to interact with the UI, for example, with a button. Yeah, so let's add a button here. Button, add a text to it, like save. On button you have a clicked event, but you cannot use events with data binding because you need to bind to an object. So instead we use something called commands when we're working with data bindings. So I can bind to a command here, and I have a command in my view model that is of type iCommand that I can bind to, and the name of that property is save. So I can use it like this. And I also have a command parameter. If I want to send a parameter to the command, I can do that by this parameter. And that I can bind to it, or I can just add a static text like hello. Okay, so let's look how this is in the view model. So main view model, here I have a command, public iCommand, name is save. I create a new command, and this is a .NET MAUI command, but you can create your own implementations if you want to of iCommand, and many MVVM libraries are doing that. And then you can pass an action that parameter, like this text, for example. You set that name by yourself, and then you can use it here in the action. But if you don't want to use the command parameter, you can also remove a string here and also the parameter. That works too. Okay, so let's set the breakpoint there and run. So here is the app with button. So when we press save here, it will run the action that you passed to the command, like this. You can see that hit by breakpoint, we have the command parameter in here. So that was the basics of data bindings. I'm sure I will touch data bindings in my upcoming videos. For example, I will do one about collection view, where I will, of course, do data bindings too. So please subscribe to my channel. There will be a lot of more .NET MAUI content. And if you like it, don't forget to like the video too. So, see you next time and goodbye.